in this episode of Plants of the Gods. Join us as we continue to focus on the ethnobotany of beer, A to Z, from Samuel Adams to Frank Zappa. We'll talk about the role of beer in the American Revolution, in Prohibition, and how a teetotaling Southern Baptist helped launch the craft beer movement. Now, a multi-billion-dollar enterprise.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Plants of the Gods. I'm Mark Plotkin, Dr. Mark Plotkin of the Amazon Conservation Team. More information on our efforts at www.amazonteam.org. Today on Plants of the Gods, we're going to revisit one of the world's most intriguing drinks, beer. This is part 2 of Antibiotic Ales to Luscious Lagers. To summarize where we left off in the previous episode, there's 2 main categories of beer: ale, which is the traditional brew, made since ancient times and made with top-fermenting yeast. Lager is of more recent vintage, pun intended, and is made with bottom-dwelling yeast at cooler temperatures. An exclusive Plants of the Gods mnemonic for remembering this: ale is hot top brew, HTP. Lager is bottom cold brew, BCB. That's HTP versus BCB. A bit of beer humor. When I was a kid in New Orleans, a popular local beer was named Regal, which is lager spelled backwards. But before we move on from beer in the ancient world, let me share an example of what studying plants not only teaches you about the ancient world itself, but the current one as well. Remember that earlier in the last episode, I noted how the ancient Greeks and Romans were wine drinkers who considered beer drinkers and beer-drinking nations as their inferiors. What does this have to do with the modern world? Major per capita wine-drinking countries in Europe today are Italy, France, and Spain, which were the heart of the Roman Empire. Major per capita consumption countries of beer in Europe are Germany, Czech, Austria, Holland, Belgium, and England, with the Romans and Greeks regarded as the barbarians. And one more note as we move on from the distant past. In the Hexing Herbs and Witchcraft episode of Plants of the Gods of a few seasons back, I addressed the use of solanaceous plants for the purposes of witchcraft and divination in the ancient world. Excavations in Germany indicate the presence of highly hallucinogenic henbane seeds in a brewery dated 6000 BCE, and the powdered seeds and roots of the closely related datura plant has been used in Russia and other parts of Europe as well as part of their favorite beers. One might wonder, why mix hallucinogens into beer and wine, since each of these substances are somewhat mind-altering on their own? Certainly, there is the "if one is good, two must be better" aspect, but there's also a biochemical basis as well. As discussed in our episode on the ethnobotany of wine, alcohol serves as a menstruum. Let me spell that, menstruum, sometimes spelled with one U. Essentially, it's a solvent which extracts the chemical constituents from the plant material. I have in the past mentioned Brian Murarescu's wonderful book, The Immortality Key, which describes the role hallucinogens played in the origin of culture and religion, particularly ancient Greek culture and the Catholic religion. In fact, I liked it so much that I interviewed him here on the pod a few seasons back. If you haven't heard it, please check it out. It's one of our most popular episodes. In the book chapter entitled Graveyard Beer, Brian revisits the historical question of which came first, bread or beer. Spoiler alert, not bread. Some have said that these are two sides of the same coin, that beer is liquid bread and bread is essentially solid beer. In any case, Brian Murarescu calls beer brewing, quote, the world's oldest biotechnology. In an exchange with Brian, Dr. Matthew Johnson of Johns Hopkins University explained why beer was not only valued for its own sake, but as a means of ingesting medicines and hallucinogens as well. Quote, beer and wine largely consist of water and alcohol, which can function as solvents capable of both extracting the active principles of psychoactive plant matter, such as seeds, flowers, leaves, and stems, and also increasing the absorption of psychoactive alkaloids, for example, from cannabis. This is important because for some psychoactive plants, whole plant material may be eaten, but minimal or no psychoactive compounds will be absorbed because they're locked into the fiber structure of the plant material. Alcohol-water solutions can liberate such compounds from the plant matter and can potentially help absorption once ingested. Another helpful quality is that if the alkaloids are fully soluble in the alcohol and water, the potency of the beverage will be homogenized. In other words, every milliliter of that beer or wine will contain as much of the active compounds, that is, the hallucinogens, as any other milliliter from the same container. This allows for consistent dosing, which is important with compounds such as those as the hallucinogenic ergot or the nightshades, which can be deadly at sufficient dosage." End of quote. As such, the concept of beer and health are deeply intertwined. In the previous episode, I mentioned the Irish tradition, only discontinued in 2009, of giving blood donors a pint of Guinness Stout because of its purported restorative qualities. What I did not mention, according to lactation expert Carlos Madrigal, is that nursing mothers in Ireland are encouraged to drink Guinness in the belief that it enhances lactation. I also mentioned, indeed emphasized, was that beer in the ancient world was not just a beverage, but a vital source of nutrition, brimming with minerals and vitamins, and in some cases, antibiotics. But also keep in mind that beer was a source of clean water. From the time people first began living in communities like in ancient Mesopotamia, access to clean water became a problem. With no scientific understanding of disease, germs, hygiene, or sanitation, once potable water turned into a poison. An insanely clever experiment demonstrated the magic of beer. Dr. Charlie Bamforth, one of the leading authorities on brewing, collected water from a duck pond teeming with nasty microorganisms like fecal coliform bacteria. Using a medieval beer recipe, they ground the malted grains, mixed it with the yucky pond water, let it sit for an hour, boiled it, and left it to ferment. After a week, they tested it, found no trace of nasty organisms, and enjoyed their new and ancient beer. Both the desire for a potable beverage as well as a need for sustenance made the availability of beer a priority for the first British settlers of what is now the United States. Both the Jamestown settlers who landed in Virginia in 1606 and the Pilgrims who came ashore in Massachusetts in 1620 brought beer with them. So anxious were these new Virginians to keep the beer flowing that they would trade vital tools to visiting sailors for beer until they were able to brew enough of their own. According to Gavin Smith, the Pilgrims had planned to land along the Hudson, but instead disembarked at Plymouth Rock because they were running out of food and beer. The first commercial brewery in the U.S. was established in 1612 in southern Manhattan by a pair of Dutch fur traders. Many European colonists were avid beer drinkers and brewers, so American commercial production increased rapidly as colonial cities like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia grew in both size and wealth. Barley and wheat, which had been grown to brew beer in Mesopotamia, also flourished in the New World and served as the basis for brewing in the American colonies. But the colonists cleverly began employing local plant products they learned from their indigenous colleagues, species unknown to Europeans in their home countries, like maple syrup, pumpkins, and corn, native to the New World. In fact, the earliest records of corn beer, also known as chicha, date back 7,000 years ago in Peru, and pumpkin ale remains a popular drink today. Speaking of colonial times, many of the founding fathers, men like Samuel Adams, Patrick Henry, Thomas Jefferson, and George Washington, were ardent promoters of domestic beer production, both to encourage the creation of domestic industries and to reduce dependence on British imports. In fact, Washington brewed his own beer at his plantation in Mount Vernon, and one of the New York Public Library's most prized artifacts is George Washington's handwritten recipe for beer on permanent public display. but it was Samuel Adams who was the most prominent brewer of the bunch. By the mid-18th century, Boston boasted a thriving brewing industry. Adams ran the family brewery, the Malt House on Purchase Street in the south end of Boston. The Malt House specialized in producing ales and porters, the most popular beers of the day. Adams used his brewery as a meeting house for colonial revolutionaries like the Sons of Liberty. As the beer flowed, well, like wine, and inspired by Adams' fiery oratorical skills, the patriots were stirred to action. As such, beer served as a catalyst for the revolution, and that is why we drink Samuel Adams Ale today and not Thomas Jefferson Lager. One side note connecting the American Republic with beer. Anacreon was an ancient Greek poet who wrote of love, revelry, and wine. In the 18th century, a British composer wrote a song in his honor, To Anacreon in Heaven, which became a popular British beer-drinking song. The tune remained the same, but American Francis Scott Key rewrote the lyrics. Based on these new lyrics and the original music, this British beer-drinking song is now our national anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner. About the same time that the American Revolution was reaching its zenith, the Industrial Revolution got its start. This era was characterized by the transition of manual labor in rural areas based on agriculture to urbanization and the switch to industrialized machine manufacture. These changes transformed everything from agriculture to steelmaking, and the production, distribution, and consumption of beer was no exception. First of all, industrialization meant more polluted water, which meant a greater incentive to drink beer. And the invention of the steam engine by James Watt in 1774 and the expansion of the railroads in the U.S. meant that breweries could not only produce beer in titanic quantities, but it could reach previously inaccessible markets. With the thirst for beer increasing, demand grew for the means to improve brewing practices. Use of the thermometer, originally invented by Galileo, and the hydrometer, invented by the Frenchman de Riva in 1814, gave the brewmasters more insight and more control of the brewing process. Equally impactful was the solution to the challenge of temperature control. As mentioned earlier, brewers from ancient Mesopotamia to the Middle Ages were at the mercy of the elements as their beer spoiled from the heat, leading to monks having to conduct their beer-making in caves and cellars. The German engineer Karl von Linde solved this age-old problem by developing the first reliable refrigeration technology in 1876, which revolutionized the cooling and fermentation process in breweries. This stunning invention, little known and appreciated by the general public, paved the way for other blockbuster achievements like preservation of both food and medicines and even the invention of air conditioning. And we owe it all to beer. We hear a lot about the British invasion of the 1960s that revolutionized the music world. Less discussed is the German invasion of the U.S. a century earlier. About 5 million Germans immigrated to the U.S. in the 19th century, and they brought their thirst and their beer brewing skills with them. Eberhard Anheuser, Adolphus Busch, Adolf Coors, Frederick Miller, and Joseph Schlitz were part of that wave. The result was Anheuser-Busch, Coors Beer, Miller Beer, and Schlitz Beer. By the end of the 19th century, there were well over 1,000 breweries in the U.S., producing an enormous variety of beers. That came to a screeching halt in early 1920 with the passage of the Volstead Act, Prohibition. This ridiculous legislation, echoing much of the nonsense being foisted on the general public today by a moralistic minority, all but destroyed the American beer industry. The ban caused brewery closures, economic hardship, and job losses across the country. The black market for illegal alcohol flourished, leading to skyrocketing crime and corruption, but lots of great movies about gangsters. Only with the end of Prohibition in 1933 did the beer industry begin to recover, but the damage ran deep. Most of the smaller breweries had either gone broke or been bought up by larger companies that had been kept afloat by making near beer or other products. The result was a reduced diversity of brewing traditions and styles. World War II, starting less than a decade after the end of Prohibition, further diminished diversity due to rationing of crucial ingredients. By the end of the war, efficiency and cost-cutting were the name of the beer-making game, as the emphasis was on streamlining production and minimizing cost. Taste was barely a consideration, as the beer companies cranked out light lagers whose flavors were barely distinguishable. The Oxford Companion to Beer said it best, quote, "Commerce, technology, and advertising converged to produce the modern American mass-market beer, a technically impressive product with far less flavor than its ancestors. The new beer took its place on shelves next to sliced white bread in plastic bags and slices of cheese food product, foods impervious to time itself. Americans were happy enough with the new beer, but once they started traveling, they soon realized that they were missing something." End of quote. The situation eventually underwent a radical change, thanks to the most unlikely change-maker in beer's 10,000-year history, a Southern Baptist teetotaler who served as the 39th President of the United States, Jimmy Carter. Carter kickstarted the craft beer movement by signing the Home Brewing Act of 1978. The law legalized home brewing, allowing individuals to make their own brew for personal consumption. The response was a tidal wave of interest in traditional methods and a wild diversity of beer styles. Home brewers became craft brewers, opening brew pubs, microbreweries, taproom breweries, and regional craft breweries across the country. Focusing on authenticity, complexity, flavor, and variety, the movement continued to attract adherents and gain momentum, not only in the U.S. but around the world. The retail dollar sales of craft beers exceed $28 billion and continues to climb. So let's talk for a minute about how beer is brewed today before we conclude this episode. The first step in beer brewing is malting, which entails soaking a grain, usually barley because it is rich in enzymes, which causes the grains to germinate. The grains are then dried to halt the germination and activate the enzymes which convert the grain starches into fermentable sugars. A bit of definition. A malt is any grain that has been both sprouted and then dried. It's the drying of the grain, the time and temperature involved, that is a major determinant of what type of beer is produced. Other additions, known as adjuncts, often from other grains like corn or rice, impact color, flavor, or foam. And extracts from plants rich in fermentable sugars can produce intriguing beers. There are now craft beers being produced in Belém at the mouth of the Amazon based on rainforest plants. Highly recommended, Taparibá Hog Plum Beer and Açaí Stout. Back to traditional brewing. The malted barley is mixed with hot water in which the enzymes convert the starch into sugar. This mix is known as wort, W-O-R-T. The wort is then boiled with hops, which both adds flavor and serves as a preservative. The hopped wort is cooled and poured into fermentation tanks where yeast is added to initiate the fermentation process in which sugars are converted into alcohol and carbon dioxide. There's a famous saying among brewmasters, quote, "Brewers make wort, but the yeast makes the beer," end of quote. In other words, in our high-tech age, it is still these tiny organisms that make the beer, just like in Mesopotamia 10,000 years ago. The beer then undergoes what is called conditioning or maturation, which allows the beer to develop and mature, a key factor in determining final flavor. Scientific advances since the invention of beer in ancient Mesopotamia, not only the understanding of microbiological processes like fermentation, but also advances in everything from hygiene to temperature control, have yielded a cornucopia of beer styles and flavors. As mentioned earlier, the two basic categories of beer are ale and lager. One of the most popular types of ales are stouts, believed to have been invented in England during the early years of the 18th century. The most popular stout is the aforementioned Guinness, much beloved around the world, but particularly in Ireland. But just to demonstrate diversity, there are milk stouts, imperial stouts, oatmeal stouts, chocolate stouts, coffee stouts, Russian imperial stout, and even oyster stout, made with real oysters and their shells. Other ales are equally diverse: Belgian lambic, British bitter, Scottish ale, German wheat beer, and India pale ale. There exist many types of lagers as well: Pilsner, Bock, Dunkel, Rautbier, Schwarzbier, to name just a few. And there are still other varieties far outside the beer-drinking mainstream: Ghost Face Killer, made with 6 kinds of ultra-hot chili peppers; Jurassic Saison, said to be brewed with 45-million-year-old yeast that was trapped in amber; and a Japanese brew made from coffee beans collected from elephant dung. And just 2 more for beer enthusiasts with a sweet tooth, or in this case, with a mouthful of sweet teeth: Creme Brulee Java Stout and Toasted Marshmallow Pumpkin Pie. At this point in time, most Americans tend to regard Germany as the beer capital of the world. However, both the Czechs and the Austrians drink even more brew on a per capita basis. Nonetheless, the Germans are unquestionably the champions of beer music. According to historian Gavin Smith, the German beer drinking music anthology is a 10-CD set. The most famous American beer song is unquestionably "What Made Milwaukee Famous Made a Loser Out of Me." Keep in mind that this is a song written by an American, Glenn Sutton, and made famous by an Englishman, Rod Stewart, about a brand of beer, Schlitz, created by a German, Joseph Schlitz, based on a recipe created in ancient Mesopotamia. Talk about globalization. Since we began this episode with A for Ale, let's finish with Z for Frank Zappa. Zappa was one of the most creative musicians of the 20th century, fusing blues, doo-wop, jazz, and psychedelic rock. He could be outrageous and funny, often both at the same time. He was both insightful and highly quotable, and particularly acerbic when speaking about rock journalism. Zappa said, quote, "Writing about music is like dancing about architecture." He also said, quote, "Most rock journalism is written by people who can't write, interviewing people who can't talk, for people who can't read." End of quote. Though very much a product of the psychedelic era, Frank Zappa did have 2 connections to our favorite brew. He had a penchant for writing peculiar song titles. One about the Arctic was entitled, quote, "Please Don't Eat the Yellow Snow." End of quote. But, speaking of our current topic, another of Zappa's memorable song titles was Titties and Beer. And Zappa's most memorable quote on the topic, quote, "You can't be a real country unless you have a beer and an airline. It helps if you have some kind of football team or some nuclear weapons, but at the very least, you need a beer." End of quote.
If you've enjoyed this podcast, please remember to check out our other episodes, from ayahuasca to magic mushrooms, from the ethnobotany of warfare to the history and prehistory of wine. Please give us a top rating and subscribe and share with like-minded folks. We appreciate your support and for the protection of the knowledge and biodiversity of South America by the Amazon Conservation Team. In our next episode, we'll hear Dr. Plotkin in conversation with Rhett Butler, discussing how best to save the rainforest.